Hello again. Welcome to In and Out of Focus. This is Sam Zervitz, and thank you, Telly Olson. Today's show, and I was asked to do this, and I'm doing it with great pleasure, and it's about Babe Ruth. And I note earlier in the week there was, and I guess there's some interest, there's considerable interest in Babe Ruth this week. There's a significant and well-publicized tour of the Babe Ruth Museum in Baltimore. Babe Ruth is a Baltimore guy. And there was a very excellent podcast on a bio of Babe, offering a bio and some insights into Babe Ruth earlier. This is my interpretation of Babe Ruth, and it's a little bit, in fact, it's considerably different because Babe Ruth is an icon. Babe Ruth has been idealized. Babe Ruth is mythological in our midst. He is widely considered the greatest, and it's arguable because there are others, of course, but he is widely considered the greatest athlete of the past century. But I have a connectedness, a familial connectedness to Babe Ruth that's a little different. And you can debate his greatness. You can debate his dark side. I'm going to talk a little bit about his dark side. He changed society. Some people change society because they're great athletes. Some people change society as athletes because they have another agenda. But anyway, my familial connectedness here goes back to my father, who was born in 1909, and I've talked about my father often on these podcasts. He was born of immigrants, and he was born, his father had a bakery, my grandfather had a bakery, my father worked in the bakery. The bakery failed, and my grandfather was a religious man who was not a great businessman, so my father, at an early age, was a great student working in the bakery and a devotee of baseball. He loved baseball. Baseball was his entree as an immigrant child into this world that my grandparents came from Russia and into Baltimore and settled in and brought him here, brought my father into this world, and then he found baseball. So anyway, he's born in 1909, and in elementary school, as he adopts baseball almost as a religion, he's got a classmate. He tells and then my father passed away in 2008, 98 years old, almost 99 years old. Anyway, he had a classmate whose father was a sports reporter. And because the classmate and my father had a mutual love of baseball, they got to see the games together in Old Oriole Park. And Jack Dunn's Orioles played in the International League there. Jack Dunn was a Baltimore legend as well. Jack Dunn got Babe Ruth out of the brutal St. Mary's home, where his father dumped him at age 6. And St. Mary's was he got to play baseball there, but he was really, really I think undervalued and underappreciated otherwise, and was certainly not well educated by them, the fathers, the priests at St. Mary's. Anyway, Jack Dunn, a few years after my father, I guess, remember this is 1909, my father's born in 1912, a lot of things happening here. You've got World War I on the horizon, the Titanic sinks, and Jack Dunn snatches Ruth out of St. Mary's. And my father, early on, belonged to something he called the Knothole Gang, where they stood outside the stadium and they looked through the fence at the games. Then, with his friend, whose father was the writer, the baseball writer, they got into the stadium to see games. Then, a little later, as a child, my father got to be a bat boy for Jack Dunn's team. And as Ruth was coming and going, my father was the bat boy. And then Ruth went on to the Red Sox, as I said, and then the Yankees, and then immortality in sports and in our world. But my father and then my father later still never lost his love of baseball. In 1933, at the height of the Depression, funny thing happened to my father. Roosevelt is going to close the banks, And my father goes in the bank to make a deposit. He knows the teller. And the teller, as he's putting his money in, the teller says in Yiddish to my father, Max Nemaros, which means take it out. And my father doesn't understand. Then he does understand. He removes all his money, and that afternoon the banks are closed. And my father has money. So he proposes to my mother, and they're off on their honeymoon. And they go to Chicago, where he gets to see Babe Ruth and the Yankees play the Chicago White Sox. And he sees Ruth at the end of his career. And, of course, Ruth in those declining years was just hanging on before he was dumped unceremoniously to the then Boston Braves. And that was a sad time for Babe Ruth. Anyway, so you've got here, what kind of a man was Babe? And I want to do some things with this because in most instances, he is considered a giant, almost iconic, and of course one of the great people of that last century. But I found something, so I'm browsing in a store, and it's a bookstore, and they got a magazine rack, and they've got baseball's greatest moments. And you've heard, and everybody who knows anything about Babe Ruth has heard, of course, he wasn't good with managers. He wasn't good with teammates. He wasn't good with fans. He wasn't wonderful. People loved him because he could hit a ball. And he could hit a ball further than anybody else, so people loved him. But he had this dark side. And the best of them was the stories about him visiting children and in hospitals and here and there, and sick kids, and signing balls for them and doing good things that way. But there was, and a lot of this was part of the myth. And part of the myth was suspect by some cynical reporters. Anyway, there was a story in a magazine in that baseball section of the bookstore, and I wanted to share it with you because this apparently was the legitimate and possibly the one and only real documented Babe Ruth visiting a child story that really happened, because it was picked up apparently shortly after. It was picked up by reporters and became a nationwide story, and some of them even suspected it was a publicity stunt. And it starts out in Vicksburg one rainy morning about 8 o'clock. An aged, bewhiskered man with wet clothes and muddy feet came into the lobby of the hotel. At the desk, he asked for Babe Ruth. He was given the number of Ruth's room on the second floor at the head of the steps. That hotel had not yet surrendered to the idea of visitors having to be announced. A few minutes later, Ruth, in bed, heard a rap at the door. He grunted and got up. In night clothes and with hair tousled, the Babe went to the door. And I'm sorry to disturb you like this, Mr. Ruth, the old gentleman apologized, but I've come to ask you for a great favor. What is it, old-timer? Asked Babe, somewhat puzzled but immediately sympathetic. Sit down. Mr. Ruth, the stranger explained, I want to get you to sign this baseball. It's for a little boy in the country, very sick. He may not get well. Ever since last fall, when we heard the Yankees were coming here to play a game, the little fellow has looked forward to seeing you. Now that he knows that he can't get out. Now that he knows that he can't get out of bed, his mother thinks the disappointment has made him worse. She's very much distressed. I figured out that it would help some if I get you to sign this ball. That would at least comfort him for a while. Where's the little fellow? Asked Ruth. He lives out in the country about 12 miles. It was quite a trip here with all the train rides and such. I'm sure I'll sign 3 balls for him, declared Ruth. Not only that, I'll take them to him. Let's go. As the astonished old gentleman looked on, Ruth called for the bellboy, ordered a big touring car, and began to get dressed. 2 hours later, he arrived at the little boy's home. The mother instantly recognized Ruth and could hardly believe her eyes. Without any preliminary conversation, she led Babe immediately to the little fellow's bedroom. At the expression on the little fellow's face, as he raised his head, his mother burst into tears. He's been delirious, she said, and he thinks he's dreaming. No, Mama, spoke the boy. It's Babe Ruth himself, isn't it? Ruth went over and sat on the side of the bed Taking 3 baseballs from his pocket, he began signing them, all the while talking to the little fellow as a pal about the game. He asked about the boys' own ball club and made several suggestions as to how they should play next summer. It was the happiest moment of the boy's life. He'll get well all right, Ruth said to the mother in the presence of the little fellow. And this summer he'll be out there hitting that baseball as hard as any of them. Nobody knew of this incident. That is, nobody in our party until we were aboard a train en route to Jackson that night. The writer of this happened to pick up a local newspaper and on the front page found the story just as related, evidently told to the editor by the old gentleman. Certainly it's true, said Ruth when asked about it. That's as little as anybody could do, isn't it? All of us took the clipping and telegraphed it, word for word, to the papers we represented. Ruth felt a little hurt, and so did we. 2 or 3 weeks later, when a cynical paragraph in a distant newspaper referred to this incident as another bit of Ruth's publicity, and it's from Along Came Ruth by Bosman Bulger in November 1931. November, December 1931. Anyway, that was the good side of Babe Ruth. But what kind of a man was he really? There are so many stories about this man-child with the heart of gold, and so many about this self-centered, vulgar, vicious, and unpleasant oaf. So we're looking for a balance here, at least in this program. And there was a dark side, and there was a wonderful side. There was a good Babe, and there was an awful Babe. And it's also known that he spent a lifetime struggling to find the real Babe Ruth and to move past the dark side. But he did terrible things to adults, and he missed his rite of passage from childhood to adult. And maybe this was the reason that the dark side was so pervasive in his life, because he never had a childhood, and he was a child in playing baseball at that time of his life. And of course the brilliant athlete, the brilliant basketball player, very, very astute Bill Russell once said about playing basketball, were men playing a boy's game. But in truth, Babe Ruth was a child playing a boy's game. And it comes down to whether we're genuinely great at something and not so nice otherwise. And do you forgive the pitfalls and the problems? And that's the core of it. An artist, an athlete, an entertainer, an inventor, a scientist, a doctor, an attorney, or whatever. If you're not a very nice person, but you're great at what you do, is your lack of civility, your lack of humanity, your lack of common decency overlooked. And I'm thinking of a scene, and particularly because baseball has its icons, and some of these icons weren't the nicest people in the world. Tris Speaker, it said, was a Klansman. Ty Cobb argued often, what people argue often, Ty Cobb was the greatest player ever, along with Babe Ruth and some of the others. And the argument, but Ty Cobb was a virulent racist as well. So anyway, you've got Field of Dreams here, and I'm thinking about Field of Dreams, and Ray Liotta, the actor playing Shoeless Joe Jackson, to Kevin Costner's Iowa farmer, and they're coming out of the cornfield, and Costner's built the Field of Dreams field, and the Shoeless Joe Jackson guy asks him if he can bring in other players, and Costner, of course, is overwhelmed by all of this, these ghosts, and they're out on his field playing, and he says, of course you can bring other players, and Jackson, in kind of a gossipy way, says that Ty Cobb wanted to play, but they wouldn't let him because nobody could stand him, and Ty Cobb, of course, was a great ball player, the epitome of evil. The irony in all of this is that a survey that was done recently, of course it had Babe right up there near the top as one of the greatest players of all time, but it was the survey that determined the 100 greatest players, and Willie Mays was number one. Willie Mays was considered in this survey, the greatest baseball player of all time. Willie Mays could do it all, and better than Babe Ruth even, and that's kind of unusual. I thought, and they didn't show you number one until they went through the whole 100, and I thought Babe Ruth, I think, was second or third, but I thought Babe Ruth would be the top of the list. Anyway, but he didn't change the world, but he changed baseball. And as an abandoned child, he was Dickinsonian in that Baltimore boys' school, and he changed into a character that became overwhelming, out of control, brutalized in that boys' home. He left to brutalize others. He was a bully. He pushed people around. He particularly didn't like, according to some sources, he was a giant, and he didn't like smaller people. He had no compunction about pushing smaller people around. He had no rules. He listened to no one. He was at the top of the baseball world, and I'll explain shortly how he got away with it. But he took to children. He loved his children. And he did some things to adults that were really, really beyond belief. He brutalized media, team owners, women managers, fans. So I'm sitting here at a desk in a computer room, a huge room upstairs. And on one side of the room, I've got some paintings I've done. On the other side, there are boxes of books that are waiting to be unpacked. And one of the pictures in the room, I actually got it at a flea market. It's a poster. And it's a poster of the back of number 3, Babe Ruth. A huge back, huge legs, huge shoulders, in mid-swing, looking out at a foul line that goes all the way to the right field stands. It's Babe in his Yankee jersey, and he's twisting around, and his swing is violent, and he's just hit one of the 714 home runs he'll slug during a career. That record broke, and everyone knows that record broken years later by the great Henry Aaron, who hit 750 some. And then, of course, Barry Bonds broke that record. The poster is large, impressive, brilliant, and it's one of my favorite pictures. And I spent a lot of money framing it too, but one can imagine it's been reproduced in all manner of sizes over the years. And there's the little poem about baseball and seasons in the right-hand corner. And it's also been said, and this is kind of apocryphal, that I saw it in the John Goodman movie, where Babe Ruth is very resentful of the young Lou Gehrig, the gentleman. He calls him a mama's boy. Gehrig is Columbia educated, an engineer, comes to baseball, was a brilliant football player as well, is well known, and is again the perfect gentleman. And about those right field stands, Ruth passes Gehrig. There are a lot of Gehrig-Ruth stories about what went on between them, not all to the good, mostly to the bad. But anyway, Gehrig passes Ruth, and Ruth, after he hits a home run, and Ruth says, "You stay out of those right field stands. They belong to me." And he says it in that very threatening way. And then somebody says to Gehrig, in this context, you're going to let him say that to you? And Gehrig says, looking skyward, Gehrig says, he's a god. But Gehrig was the perfect gentleman. And Ruth had no family. And among other things that were pointed out in a little bit more insightful biographical sketches of these two, Gehrig was called by Ruth a mama's boy. Ruth and Gehrig's mother didn't get along. Ruth's second wife, Claire, didn't get along with Gehrig's wife, Eleanor, who didn't get along with Gehrig's mother either. And then, of course, in the film versions, Ruth got to pick William Bendix, a grade B actor, to play himself. Gehrig didn't pick anybody, but Gary Cooper, of course, was brilliant as Lou Gehrig in that story, and of course tore your heart out when he did his speeches at Yankee Stadium. I'm the luckiest man on the face of the earth. Anyway, today, as I'm addressing this, there is ongoing a well-publicized tour of Babe Ruth's museum taking place that, I'm aware of, and, and I guess I could have gone on the tour. Everybody was invited to the tour. The tour has been publicized for weeks. And then again, of course, there's that sense of Babe Ruth, and the hospital rooms that kind of saves the Babe. And the one I just read was the one that's verifiable, while the others have some question about their provability. Anyway, Ruth was born, as was noted in the earlier Babe Ruth podcast, in 1895. It was South Emery Street, and it was to Kate Schamberger, George Ruth Sr., and he was given the name. Babe was George Herman Ruth, and he was German and Irish, and he lived 6 years, as I mentioned, above a Camden Street saloon and on the streets. And it was the worst part of the waterfront at those times, and he ran the streets, and he was always in trouble, so his father gave up on him and dumped him in St. Mary's Home, and where the museum is that they're having the tour of today, as I'm doing the broadcast. And I never visited that museum, unfortunately. I want to, and I intend to. And they always say, in publicizing it, it's a long home run away from Camden Yards, where the Orioles play. But the iconic Babe Ruth, the historic Babe Ruth, the human side, the notorious womanizer, the Babe Ruth that's profane to a fault, the drunk who consumed enormous amounts of liquor and food, who was the party animal, then the sainted Babe Ruth, the immortalized in death as one of our greatest and most influential heroes. 80,000 people show up for Babe Ruth's funeral in 1948. But in his legendary career, of course, the stock joke that's been often repeated that Babe said, or maybe it was just made up, you can never be sure, because a lot of these Yogi Berra-isms were attributed to reporters who were making up Yogi Berra. Anyway, so Babe Ruth, somebody says to Babe Ruth, and he was making a healthy six-figure salary at the time. Somebody says to Babe Ruth, you made more than the president this year. And Babe said, why not? I had a better year than he did. And I worked downtown, and I walked those streets, and and it was before, in the pre-museum days, I actually walked Camden Yards, which was Babe's old stomping ground before Camden Yards was built. And one of the construction workers there, as they were putting that park together, I said, is this going to be the park? And he said, yeah, and he pointed to a corner and said, that's where home plate's going to be, and I never forgot that. And then I just went to a ball game the other night, and I was thinking I was here when it was a parking lot. And from a sports perspective, and then, of course, from a sports perspective, he was a god, as Lou Gehrig said. And I'm thinking about Babe Ruth, and I'm thinking about walking down around that area. And I'm thinking about, I was in Israel twice, and we walked around Jerusalem, and was thinking about walking the streets of downtown Baltimore. Maybe it's stretching a point a little bit, but walking around the streets of Jerusalem, Nazareth, Hebron, Beit Shan, the oldest continuous city in the world. And I'm thinking, and of course you couldn't help but think then, Jesus walked here, Moses walked here, David and Solomon walked here, Abraham and Isaac walked here, Jacob and Sarah maybe took a little shopping stroll, Esther and Miriam, and the home of the Old Testament figures. And they strolled in their off hours while they were communing with the Almighty. They walked around here. So I'm walking around where Babe Ruth lived, and Babe Ruth, in our, concept of our own, forgivable idolatry. I don't worship. We worship Babe Ruth, and Babe Ruth was here in from 1895 on until he was, in around 1895. He was 6 in 1901. His father dumped him in St. Mary's, and I was walking around Camden Yards too. So I actually walked on the streets Babe Ruth walked on 80 years before. And then I attended the first game at Camden Yards in 1991. I attended the last game at Old Memorial Stadium the year before, and I still have that original program from 1991 where Rick Sutcliffe pitched for us. And here's where sports is a religion and becomes something near worship. And I'm comfortable in comparing Babe's Sacred Landscape with my earlier trips to Israel because we worship our sports figures. We worship Johnny Unitas. We worship Brooks Robinson. We worship Babe Ruth. My father actually said in his days as a boy, in and around the Jack Dunn Orioles, said there was a player that Jack Dunn had. Jack Dunn, if you don't know the history of Jack Dunn in the 1920s actually had a team that was better than most major league teams. It featured Lefty Grove, George Earnshaw, Joe Bowley, Max Bishop, and some of the great players that came after the great Yankee teams of the 20s that Connie Mack bought directly from Jack Dunn and put together as his Philadelphia Athletics teams. And Jack Dunn's teams won 7 straight International League pennants in the 20s. My father followed this. We had another familial connection here because in the 20s, and I never met him, of course, way before my time, was Uncle Abe Feynman. Uncle Abe Feynman was a Baltimore clothier who had an advertising sign in center field in the old Oriole Park. And the story my father told was, if a player could hit that sign on the fly, Uncle Abe gave him a suit. And Uncle Abe actually was responsible for putting Joe Bowley on the Philadelphia Athletics team as the finishing piece of Connie Mack's great 1930s teams with Jimmy Fox and Mickey Cochran and the rest of them, and Lefty Grove, George Earnshaw, and the rest of them. Anyway, Bowley was the last of the players that Jack Dunn was hanging on to. He sold everybody else to Connie Mack. All the other great players went to Connie Mack. So Bowley couldn't get out of there and wanted to leave and get his shot at the major leagues too. So he goes to Uncle Abe and he tells Uncle Abe at the time, talk to Jack, tell him I've been like a son to him, and tell him I've always done everything he wanted and I want my chance too, and he's not letting me go. And Uncle Abe talked to Jack, and shortly after that, Joe Bowley went up to the A's as well. It wasn't a minor league system then. It was just that you had players, the major leagues wanted them. And as Babe Ruth went to the Red Sox from Jack Dunn about 1913, 1914, so too did Joe Bowley go to Connie Mack's A's. Anyway, his story, and you have to almost revise history for Babe Ruth. He was, I wonder about people who were, and Babe Ruth was, I wonder about this. Babe Ruth was, based on his ability to hit a baseball, Babe Ruth was one of the most influential people of the last century, child of humble origins. Called incorrigible, and that was mentioned in the interview earlier. And Dickinsonian almost. Dickinson would have written. So you have the John Goodman movie, where the term incorrigible is used over and over again. And Goodman's movie is the Dark Side movie. And then you have the William Bendix movie where you have the delightful, charming, clown-like, childlike Babe Ruth. And they compare remarkably in terms of the two sides of the Babe. And I don't know whether the John Goodman movie was more the truth. But this is interesting now. I read this years ago because Babe Ruth was such a prominent and well-known figure, and because everybody knew who Babe Ruth was. Babe Ruth was he was our greatest export. And the Russians, the Stalinist Russians, were tried at their best at the time to intimate that they got there first. They did it first. They invented baseball. And they said their greatest baseball player was somebody named Bobbis Root. And they thought of him first. They had him first. And I read that, and I was amazed. But then there was the Babe, the Sultan of Swat, the King of Clout. And you had a classic little rite of passage movie, Sandlot, where the kids have the one kid, of course, who's trying to join the group, and they've got Benny the Jet Rodriguez, and they've got the Latin kid, and they got all the other kids, the little fat kid, and the kid who makes the pass at the lifeguard around the neighborhood swimming pool and winds up marrying her. And jumps, and the kid around the swimming pool, he pretends he's drowning in the pool, so she comes over to give him artificial respiration, and he kisses her, and then she slaps him, and later in the little asides at the end of the movie he marries her. But anyway, this beautiful rite of passage movie, where this kid wants desperately to be part of the neighborhood gang of baseball, and they play baseball as at the heart of their activity agenda. And this kid says something, and they say something about Babe Ruth, and this kid says, who? And they say the Sultan of Swat, the King of Clout, the rest of it, and they give him a terrible fit over not knowing who Babe Ruth is. And later, because he didn't know who Babe Ruth was, and his father, he's adopted, and his father has a room full of baseball memorabilia, including an autographed Babe Ruth baseball. And they're out of baseballs because they've hit a baseball over the fence into James Earl Jones. James Earl Jones plays these parts all the time. James Earl Jones plays the blind old ball player with a huge dog that chews up baseballs and doesn't give them back after they hit over the fence. So this kid takes his Babe Ruth baseball out of his father's study, and they play with it, and then it gets hit into the yard, and finally James Earl Jones comes out of the house toward the end of the movie, and the kids explain why they're back there looking for the baseball that the huge monster dog is chewing up, and James Earl Jones takes the kid in, explains he was a ball player, he knew George. And they called Babe Ruth George Herman George. So he knew George, and he said he could strike George out. He was very good, and he's blind, and he got hit. Apparently lost his sight, and he gives the kid an autographed baseball signed by Murderers Row, the 1927 Yankees. And the father, of course, is furious that the kid took his ball out, but he got a better one back for it. Anyway, that was a great little bit in that movie. And then James Earl Jones is the writer in Field of Dreams, who follows Shoeless Joe Jackson into the cornfield. And because he's going to get a story on Shoeless Joe Jackson. And there's Kevin Costner yelling, I want to go. And the Shoeless Joe Jackson character, Ray Liotta, says, you don't go, we want him. And then off they go into the cornfield. And some wonderful stories, but James Earl Jones loves being these kind of like these cameo roles in baseball, apparently in baseball movies. Anyway, and it's also said that one of the legends of Babe Ruth is during spring training, he had the longest home run ever hit, and it traveled over 600 feet, and now 400 feet is considered a monster hit. And then the real story about the center field, about him pointing to center field and calling his shot. And I'll talk about that a little later, because he didn't do it. He didn't do it. A sports writer saw Babe pointing to center field and gave it that identification forevermore. And then I've got something here I also want to share with you. Dennis Lillane is a wonderful writer. And he's a wonderful writer of history and other things. And Dennis Lillane, in terms of capturing a time and place, is probably second to none. So he's got a book here called The Given Day. And I want to share a couple of pages about this, because it's about Boston and Babe Ruth's time in Boston in 1918, before Harry Frazee, the theater guru, who owns the Red Sox at the time and can't stand Babe Ruth. He calls him uncivilized, a savage. Babe Ruth has no social skills at all, and Frazee is one of these very finicky characters. And he sells him to the Yankees, and that is the launching of the curse of the Bambino, when it took Boston 100 years to win a World Series again after selling Babe Ruth to the Yankees, the worst trade in baseball history. And here is a little bit of Dennis Lillane. Due to travel restrictions placed on Major League Baseball by the War Department, the World Series of 1918 was played. And this is the series before the Black Sox scandal. And after the Black Sox scandal, baseball looked doomed. People didn't want any part of it, because allegedly 8 Baltimore Black Sox players took bribes to rig the series against the Cincinnati Reds. And they brought in Kennesaw Mountain Landis, this vicious judge from Kentucky, to suspend from baseball forever the eight players, including shoeless Joe Jackson, who was illiterate and couldn't read and probably put an X on a piece of paper, but had no idea what he had done in terms of that fix when allegedly the players took bribes. But Babe Ruth saved baseball. He came in with the Yankees a year or so later and hit 59 home runs, more than everybody else put together. And baseball changed forever from a sport of strategy, a hit 'em where there ain't sport, a wee wheelie killer, hit 'em where they ain't sport. It changed into a homer haven where the players that hit the home runs were the gods of the sport. And then in 1927, he broke his own record with 60 as part of the Yankees' all-time greatest team, and maybe the greatest team ever, the Murderers Row team. Anyway, here's Dennis Lane. Due to travel restrictions placed on Major League Baseball by the War Department, the World Series of 1918 was played in September and split into 2 homestands. The Chicago Cubs hosted the first 3 games, with the final 4 to be held in Boston. On September the 7th, after the Cubs dropped Game 3, the 2 teams boarded a Michigan Central train together to embark on the 27-hour trip, and Babe Ruth got drunk and started stealing hats. They had to pour him onto the train in the first place. After the game, he'd gone to a house a few blocks east of Wabash where a man could find a steady supply of liquor and a woman or two. And if Stuffy McGinnis hadn't known where to look for him, he would have missed the train home. As it was, he parked off to the rear of the caboose. He puked off the rear of the caboose on the train, chugged out of Central Station at a little after 8 in the evening, and wound up way past the stockyards. And by the way, as an addendum here, if you saw The Natural, you saw the Babe, the whammer, they called him in Barry Levinson's movie, get off the train, and then the Robert Redford character, who was actually Eddie Wakes, who got shot in a hotel room later, and Bernard Mellon, with the writer, was playing this off as part of his novel. And the character, the Robert Redford character, in a park near the train, struck the whammer out. And the whammer was Babe Ruth on that train, too. And the air was swollen with smoke and the stench of butchered cattle. And Ruth was damned if he could find a star in the black sky. He took a pull from a flask and rinsed the vomit. Let me see what I've got here. He rinsed the vomit from his mouth with a gargle of rye and spit it over the iron rail and watched the spangle of Chicago's skyline rise before him as he slid away from it, as he often did when he left the place, and his body was leaden with booze. He felt fat and orphaned. He drank more rye. At 23, he was finally becoming one of the more feared hitters in the league. In the year when home runs in the American League had totaled 96, Ruth accounted for 11, damn near 12%. Even if someone took into account the 3-week slump he suffered in June, pitchers had started to treat him with respect. Opposing hitters, too. Ruth had pitched the Sox to 13 wins that season. He also started 59 games and left and 13 at first. He couldn't hit lefties, though. It was a knock on him, even when every roster had been stripped of its shells by the players who'd enlisted in the war. Ruth had a weakness for opposing managers had begun to exploit. Fuck 'em. He said it to the wind and took another hit from the flask, a gift from Harry Frazee, the team owner. Ruth had left the team in July, went to play for Chester Shipyard's team in Pennsylvania because Coach Barrow valued Ruth's pitching arm far more than his bat, and Ruth was tired of pitching. You threw a strikeout, you got applause. You hit a home run, you got mass eruption. Problem was, the Chester Shipyards preferred his pitching too. When Frazee threatened them with a lawsuit, Chester Shipyard shipped Ruth back. Frazee had met the train and escorted Ruth to the back seat of his Rauch and Lang electric opera coupe. It was a marathon. It was maroon with black trim, and Ruth was always amazed how you could see your reflection in the steel no matter what the weather or the time of day. He asked for Z what it cost, a buggy like this, and for Z idly fondled the gray upholstery as his driver pulled onto Atlantic Avenue. "More than you, Mr. Ruth," he said, and handed Ruth his flask. The inscription, etched in the pewter, read, "Ruth, G.H., Chester, Pennsylvania, 7118. 7718. He fingered it now and took another swig, and the greasy odor of cow's blood mixed with the metallic smell of factory towns and warm train tracks. "I am Babe Ruth," he wanted to shout off the train, "and when I'm not drunk and alone in the back of a caboose, I'm someone to be reckoned with, a cog in the wheel, yes, and you bet I know it, but a diamond-crusted cog, the cog of cogs, someday." Ruth raised his flask and toasted Harry for Z, and all the Harry for Z's in the world, with a string of lewd epitaphs and a bright smile. Then he took a swig, and it went to his eyelids and tugged him downward. "I'm going to sleep, you old whore," Ruth whispered in the night, to the skyline, to the smell of butchered meat, to the dark Midwestern fields that lay ahead, to every ashen mill town between here and Governor Square, to the smoky, starless sky. He stumbled into the stateroom he shared with Jones, Scott, and McGinnis, and when he woke at 6 a.m, still fully clothed, he was in Ohio. He ate breakfast in the dining car and drank 2 pots of coffee and watched the smoke pour from the stacks in the foundries of the steel mills that squashed in the Black Hills. His head ached, and he added a couple of drops from his flask to his coffee cup, and his head didn't ache anymore. He played canasta for a while with Everett Scott, and then the train made a long trip to Summerford, another mill town, and they stretched their legs in a field just beyond the station, and that's where he first heard of a strike. It was Harry Hooper, the Sox team captain and right fielder and second baseman, Dave Shane, talking to the Cubs left fielder Leslie Mann and catcher Bill Killefer. McGinnis said the four of them had been thick as thieves the whole trip. About what? Babe Ruth was not sure he cared. "Don't know stuff," he said. "Muffin flies for a price, you think, Tankin?" Hooper crossed the field to them. "We're going to strike, boys," Stuffy McGinnis said. "You're drunk," Hooper shook his head. "They're fucking us, boys." "Who? The commissioner? Who do you think?" "Heidler, Herman, Johnson, them." Stuffy McGinnis sprinkled tobacco into a slip of rolling paper and gave the paper a delicate lip as it twisted the ends. "How so?" "They changed the gate distribution of series, the percentage of receipts. They did it last winter, and they didn't tell us until now." "Wait," McGinnis said. "We get 60% of the first 4 gates." Harry Hooper shook his head, and Ruth could feel his attention begin to wander. He noticed telegraph lines stretched at the edge of the field and wondered if you could hear them hum if you got close enough. "Gate receipts distribution." Ruth wanted another plate of eggs and more bacon. Harry said, we used to get 60%, now we get 55%. Attendance is down. The war, you know, and it's our patriotic duty to take 5% less. McGinnis shrugged. Then we forfeit 40% of that to Cleveland, Washington, and Chicago. For what? For kicking their ass to 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Then another 10% to the war charities. "You see in this now?" Stuffy scowled. He looked ready to kick someone small he could really get his legs into. Anyway, that's Dennis Lehane and his view of Babe Ruth in his book, The Given Day. A bleak racist America, a bleak Boston, a journey south. Babe Ruth is a cameo character. And the chapter is the Ruth in Ohio, and it's a take on the nuances and the dirty little secrets that were pieces of the puzzle that was our nation in 1918. And then Lehane's perspective is accurate. He's got the history in detail there. Ruth moving on the next season to New York would redefine the nation in his time. And in a literary and metaphorical way, on that train, that journey, was the character of a people, a nation, a way of life, that helped form us for the rest of the century. One of the most influential half-centuries in the history of Western civilization. 2 world wars, a depression, all of that. And a debate about baseball, about the nation. Was the Babe our greatest player? It says clearly, and it says accurately in the book, the bio, the wonderful bio written by Ken Sobel. It says this was an undereducated, abandoned no social skills, and he really didn't have anything else except he was a lost soul who never really found himself until the end of his life. But now here's a comparison. Here's a comparison to other players. You had, and compare this, who was the more influential, the more heroic, the more iconic, the more significant athlete in the last century, Jackie Robinson or Babe Ruth? And Jackie Robinson, educated, talented, driven, purposeful. And who would you say was better known, more influential, more revered? And Jackie or Babe? But there's a line in the sand that separates the races in society in Lahane's 1918 depiction of how it was. Babe and Lou Gehrig and Lefty Grove and the great teams of All-Stars that barnstormed. Babe maybe wasn't a racist because these guys played all the great players, the great black players that were better than they were. And they conceded they were better than they were. And there were players that were better than Babe Ruth even. And in my father's time, he attended these games where the black players, the black all-stars played, and he acknowledged they were better. My father saw them up front and said they were better than the Lou Gehrigs and the Lefty Groves and the Babe Ruths. And on this note, I'm reminded, and I saw it, I don't know what happened to it. It was a gem of a movie. It might have been made for TV. And it was an account of the 1940s. And how Jackie Robinson got into the major leagues. And it might have been, I think he played for Kansas City. He got out of the Army, played for Kansas City. He came out of UCLA. He was a sports star, brilliant athlete, very bright guy, very much his own guy, and an exemplary human being all the way, came out of California. Anyway, I saw this movie, so you've got Jackie, Satchel Paige, and Josh Gibson. And Josh Gibson was pretty well acknowledged to be much better than Babe Ruth. He was called the Babe Ruth of his league. And the greatest player perhaps ever, the greatest home run hitter, the greatest catcher. And Josh Gibson never got to the major leagues because he had terrible emotional problems. Satchel Paige was maybe too much of an activist and wouldn't have deferred the activism and was a little old at the time. Jackie was younger. Jackie was the rookie, and Jackie got the chance. Branch Rickey gave Jackie the chance. And Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige were furious about it and didn't think Jackie had paid his dues enough to get there first. And it was very important, apparently, to Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige that they be the first. Rickey was looking for more than a talented ball player. He was looking for an educated, aware gentleman to be able to defer his own feelings, to mask his own feelings, to get through a year or two, to have something larger happen that would change the game forever. And it would take near superhuman strength to do it, and you saw it in the two Jackie Robinson movies. You read about it, and you knew about it. And Satchel was one of the greatest pitchers ever, but he wouldn't get his chance. And of course, Josh Gibson wouldn't get his chance because he was a manic depressive, and he would go into deep fits of doubt and depression, and you couldn't have that either. In spite of the fact that Josh Gibson was considered, Willie Mays aside, Babe Ruth aside, Ty Cobb aside, all these players in the 30s and 40s, 20s, 30s, and 40s aside, he was considered the greatest baseball player who ever lived as well. And it used to be said that Josh Gibson would hit a home run in Pittsburgh and it would come down in Cleveland or something like that. Anyway, that was a great movie. But Dick Schaap, S-C-H-A-A-P, Schaap, in his introduction to Sobel's work on Babe Ruth, it's called Babe Ruth and the American Dream, he wrote, and this to me sums it up so beautifully. He wrote, "The man is dead, and so are his most notable records." Babe Ruth died in August of 1948. Yet Babe Ruth remains the personification of professional sports in America. And it was so much so, and I'll finish the Schaap thing here, it was so much so that if you were Johnny Unitas, you were called the Babe Ruth of football. If you were somebody else, you were called the Babe Ruth of basketball. Michael Jordan could have been the Babe Ruth of basketball. Oscar Robertson could have been the Babe Ruth of basketball. My contention all along has been Bill Russell was the greatest player who ever lived because he won every year. He won, and he was smarter than anybody else. if he wasn't Will Chamberlain, or he wasn't Michael Jordan, or he wasn't Oscar Robertson, or he wasn't Jerry West, or he wasn't Elgin Baylor. He was just smarter. And you listen to Bill Russell interviewed, and you know how genuinely bright and how astute he was about sports and about life in America. Anyway, here's back to Dick Schaap. Babe Ruth. He embodied all that was good about pro sports and most of what was bad. He was living proof and is still mythic proof that through sports a man can rise from common, vulgar beginnings to wealth, fame, to a position of influence and impact, attained only by movie stars and singers and a handful of presidents. He was Marilyn Monroe up from the sticks, Sinatra from the streets, Eisenhower from the farm. He may have been bigger than all of them. Babe Ruth was living proof that through sports a man could rise to greatness. And in my and I was a baby when Babe Ruth died, but I knew the name Babe Ruth. And then I mentioned earlier the William Bendix movie focusing on the childlike, lovable, fun-filled giant clown of a man, and the John Goodman movie where the word incorrigible would send him into a deep, deep, dark depression. If anybody, then there were, of course, The Natural, Malamud's novel, The Natural, and this is something that maybe explains how different times and places and different writers and reporters and observers of society in transition interpret Babe Ruth's time. In Babe Ruth's time, Babe Ruth was protected. Sports stars were protected, and you didn't write about the bad. You only made them into mythical and bigger than life people, because that's what people wanted to hear. We needed during the Depression, we needed during World War II to have our sports stars to worship, and nobody was going to bring them down to a lower level. Then you had, when we passed that and we became, after World War II, a wealthy, great power, the greatest country in the history of the world, sports figures didn't have to be idealized anymore. And you got them as they were, and the writers and the people who reviewed a time and place would tell you that Ted Williams was a curmudgeon, that Joe DiMaggio was not a nice person, that Mantle was a drunk. Mays was all right. Mays was an innocent. Mays was all right, and you got a different picture of what they were, because they were being, you could vilify them justifiably, and you could get a more honest interpretation of what they were. But there was a problem here, too, because you really were being brought, they really were being brought down to a level that maybe you didn't want to hear about either. And life and legend and depictions. And so it's a juxtaposition here. So Barry Levinson, in a time and place when sports figures are being vilified, allows his figure in The Natural and Bernard Malamud. Bernard Malamud had the guy strike out. Barry Levinson had the guy at the end, the Knight. He was the New York Knight. He was the Knight. He was Lancelot. Had the New York Knight hit the home run that won the game, that broke the light tower, that had the light like stars coming out of it. The mighty Casey of Bernard Malamud became, in the Greek, in Malamud's Greek myth, became the hero of all heroes. And a wounded hero came back to win the day. And he changed Malamud's novel around. And Redford, of course, borrowing the Ted Williams, the famous Ted Williams quote, and it could have been, again, apocryphal, it could have been mythical, the famous Ted Williams quote in Ted Williams' way of thinking. And Ted Williams guarded his eyes. Ted Williams never went to a movie. Ted Williams' eyes were the most perfect eyes in the world. He had a remarkable vision. Ted Williams, in striving for what he wanted, as a as the greatest, he said, "I want to be the best there ever was." And in the Barry Levinson movie, the Robert Redford character says, when somebody says, "What do you want?" he says, "I want to be the best there ever was." And legends fall, or legends live, depending largely on the time and place, not the legend self, but the time and place and how we need to interpret them to maybe have a better sense of ourselves and a better sense of where we are. And here comes the John Goodman movie. The John Goodman movie is a dark, dark film about a dark, dark character in a dark, dark era who does things that are brutal. He actually hangs at one point in the movie, and whether he did it or not, he certainly took Miller Huggins, the Yankee manager in the 20s, to task. He hangs Miller Huggins in one telling scene. A drunk, partying Babe Ruth up all night arrives too late for spring training, and Huggins roasts him for it. And he just laughs at Huggins, and Huggins tells him get in uniform, and Babe, in a suit, gets up to hit, slams balls miles and miles out of the park. And they're looking at him like, who else could have done that? And then Huggins is roasting him. They go back to the train car, and in that scene, Babe Ruth can't take it anymore, and he's holding Huggins, the little man, by his feet over the side of the train car, as if it's a window, as if it's the ledge of a window in a building, and he looks like he's going to drop him. And of course he's fined and he's suspended. And then there's a scene where a fan is giving him a fit because he's terribly out of shape and he can't hit, and he's in a slump, and he runs into the stands and he tries to beat up the fan. And in the William Bendix version, when that Babe Ruth is having trouble, he says, "Be good to the game, and the game will be good to you." In the John Goodman version, the game, Claire, his second wife, is saying, "The game isn't good to you," because Colonel Rupert hasn't given him his opportunity to manage, and roasts him here by saying, "You couldn't even manage your family. How can you manage the team?" And then Claire, the wonderful actress Kelly McGillis, runs into Rupert after Babe is thrown out, and Rupert says, "Get out of here," and she says, "No." And he says, "Babe ought to be ashamed of himself," and Claire says, "No, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. He saved the game. He saved you." And it's a wonderful scene, and Kelly McGillis is a wonderful, as she plays the saving grace to Babe, the counterpoint to Babe, his second wife, Claire, who pretty well makes him as good as he's ever going to be as a human being. And it kind of, and Claire, of course, this Kelly McGillis character, if you remember her, I don't think she works anymore in Hollywood, but she's done some wonderful movies. She was the Amish woman opposite Harrison Ford, who was John Book, the Philly cop hiding on the Amish farm. And they, of course, were from different worlds. But she was very, very good at being that Amish woman. And the scene where she's in Colonel Rupert's office telling him off is a beautifully rendered scene. Anyway, and then Colonel Rupert, who maybe told the truth in this scene, that Babe never did grow up, becomes off as despicable. Worse than Harry Frazee, the Boston owner who gave Ruth a fit before he sold him off to the Yankees for $120,000 and brought Boston the curse of the Bambino. Anyway, on a closing note, here's a little research on the shot Ruth called and the home run he hit in the World Series off the Cubs' Charlie Root. And even in the John Goodman movie, this Charlie Root character kept showing up as a pitcher to try to show up Babe Ruth. And Ken Sobel's Ruth's biography got it from those closest to it. And those closest to it, who knew it by being on hand and observing it, said it was accidental. It was invented by a radio broadcaster named Husing. And at the time, it was in the World Series. And, of course, the Yankees slaughtered the Cubs, and they were much better. But they were the benches were all shouting at Babe. And Babe got a couple of strikes on him. Root got a couple of strikes on him. So he points at the mound that he still has a strike left. He holds up a finger and he points at the mound that he has a strike left. And he warns. And also, there's a possibility he's warning the Cubs. There's another game. He'll be back another day to get him, so watch out. So Husing sees Babe pointing and it looks like he's pointing at the outfield. And he says, and the other writers in the press box back him up, he says, looks like he's calling his shot. And he hits the next pitch for a home run into the center field bleachers, and they say it was prophetic. And it goes out over the airwaves, and it becomes another chapter in Ruth's career, another legend of the Babe. And the Huggins, of course, was the dark side of it, the John Goodman movie, I have an eerie feeling, was much closer to what the Babe was than the William Bendix version of the clown, of the fun-loving clown. And on that note, here's kind of why the fun-loving, gargantuan, wonderful, iconic, mythical Babe somehow outplayed the dark side Babe. And this comes out of the part of the Sobel book too. The players took him for what he was and believed as a team he was not judged by the standards that governed others. Others were, and this was Lou Gehrig saying he's a god. Others were accepted based on their clubhouse persona and their play in the field. The Babe brought a third category to how players rated each other. He brought with him an overwhelming public image that had to influence how you related to him. Millions of fans adored him. How could they be wrong about him? And the one writer said, how does this vulgar kid become the game's symbol and idol, beloved by more people with more intensity than anyone who ever came before? The adulation was the driving force that most influenced how the teammates viewed him. So Babe passes away August 1948. 80,000 people come to the funeral. I mentioned that earlier. He was overwhelmingly remembered as a great American and a wonderful ball player. And one priest called him a crusader with a bat instead of a lance. And a great last line, as the two pallbearers are hauling the casket of Babe away. One of them says to the other, it's a steamy hot August day, and one of them says, I could really go for a beer. And the other one says, so would the Babe. And that's my take on Babe Ruth from various points of view. Dennis Lillane, Ken Sobel, others. The dark side, the good side, the Babe that of course loved children because he lost his own childhood, and children he could identify with. And he was brutalized as a child, so he turned it around, and any child was a good child to him, was a wonderful child to him, was a child to be given an autographed ball, was a child to visit in the hospital, was a child to really, really turn it on, turn it up for. He was the Babe. And he loved children. He was the Babe. He was a very, very complex figure at best. And that's my take on Babe Ruth for this week. And thank you for being with me. And I'll be with you next week with another slant on another subject. Have a great week.